Back. Hello. How you doing, Mike? I just want to start off by saying thank you to a few people. First of all, you may recall that at the very beginning of 2020, we had the church refinished inside and repainted, and we haven't had a chance to see it. But having come back again, it looks beautiful, really. Everything's fresh and clean. It's just very nice. So we thank Fortunato and his crew for that. Also, when came in here today, the parking lot and the sidewalks were clear. Thank you to Jerry, Venn, and Orville. And just thanks to all the people running the technology, both here and behind the scenes. And I'm sure there are people I missed too, Zenny and Derby checking people in. So we're happy to be here. What do you say? Today I want to go into my third presentation on a series of sermons that the elders and the new pastor and I agreed to do at the beginning of the year. We're doing a series on the teachings of Jesus. And I just want to remind you of why we chose that. It actually goes back to our New Year's Eve service that we have as a tradition here in Jackson Heights. I was asked to speak about the church. And I thought to myself, well, what is the church really? When it gets down to it, the church is the group of people who profess to believe in Jesus and follow what he says. Am I right? So it seemed to me, you know what? We often study Old Testament letters of Paul, sometimes Daniel, sometimes Revelation. It might be good to start this new year, 2021, actually looking at what Jesus himself said and what he taught us. Not only that, the New Testament makes it clear that of all the revelations that God has brought to the human race through Moses, through prophets, through, like I say, Paul and the apostles, Jesus was the most accurate, the clearest revelation of God of all. So why shouldn't we listen to what he has to say? It's expected and it's what we should do. So today we're going to continue that. We're going to look at a passage in Matthew chapter 5, so I invite you to turn there. As you heard, I selected verses 24 and 23 and 24 for the scripture reading, and that will be the main focus. But as you know, every Bible text that we can look at has a setting, right? So these passages are actually part of a larger section in Matthew and a subsection that starts really in verse 17. Now, we're going to read that in a minute. Well, let's read it now. Jesus is this is the Sermon on the Mount, by the way. This is Matthew's account of what he preached after he went up on the mountainside. Verse 17 says, "Do not think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. And as you may recall, there are a number of clues or indications in the Gospel of Matthew that indicate or give us the impression that he was writing primarily for a Jewish audience, where the Jewish people of his day had a choice either to remain in the synagogue and worship in the traditional manner or accept Jesus. So he tried to frame his message in such a way to appeal to those people. And what he's saying here in this section is, and Matthew is quoting, Jesus is making it clear that he did not come to dismiss or eject, the old teachings, or to relax the standard of righteousness that God had given to the people in the times past, and as outlined in the teachings of Moses, of what we call the Torah, right? Jesus wasn't coming to throw out the Torah. No, instead, what the New Testament writers and followers understood him to do was he was clarifying, he was refining. You can almost say he was distilling the teachings of Moses and its major themes and showing what were its vital principles. So this is the setting in which we read the passage that we're going to go to for today. As a matter of fact, on this point, look what Jesus says in verse 20. It's not that he's throwing out the past. He's saying, no, in fact, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. So by no means was Jesus saying, okay, you could just relax and it doesn't matter, how you live or what you do. He says, actually, if it's a choice between the synagogue and my people, you should come to our side because we're going to even seek a higher standard. That's what Jesus is saying. And then as you'll see in the rest of chapter 5, Jesus uses 6 comparisons in which he says, you have heard this before. In other words, you've read from Moses and the prophets, but here's what I'm going to say. So that's the setting in which we're going to look at this. This is Jesus' way of conveying a higher standard for Christian discipleship, for conveying what God's goal and vision really were for his people. So with all of that background, let's look at the section. There are 3 sayings that come together. Verse 21, Jesus says, you have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into fiery hell. Wow. So Jesus, like I said, he's quoting what people have heard, but he's elaborating on it, right? And in this case, he's contrasting a statement that actually comes from the 10 Commandments. You shall not murder, right? That's a more accurate translation than you shall not kill. So everybody knew that you're not supposed to be murdering people, right? But Jesus actually takes it further, and he says, well, God's law actually involves a lot more than merely restraining bad actions, Jesus says here. He says God's will encompasses your words, the words that you say to other people. It says, what is it? How did I translate it? You good for nothing. In some of the other Bible versions, it says raka, right? Now, we don't use that word raka. That's an Aramaic word. And I looked it up. It's kind of like saying a person is an airhead. Literally, they say it means it's an empty head. Or one of the translations say, you're a numbskull. So Jesus is saying, not only should you not murder, don't even say things like that to other people, to your fellow human beings. So it's God's will encompasses not just the restraining bad actions, but your words, your attitudes, and your feelings towards each other. You see what's happening here? These are the teachings of Jesus. He's giving us an idea of what God really values, and it actually goes beyond some of the restrictions that the people had already known about. It's not enough to merely refrain from murdering people. It's not enough even just to refrain from causing them bodily injury. You're not even supposed to use hurtful and demeaning words. Instead, the ideal is actually to resist feelings of anger. Look, we all will feel that, right? That's part of the human nature. We have feelings. God built us with emotions. And sometimes we feel hurt. Sometimes we feel abused. Sometimes you feel angry. So it's not wrong to have the feeling. The question is what we do with it. What Jesus is saying here is you have to deal with it. You can't just let it out. You have to deal with feelings of resentment and anger. To phrase that positively, instead of just in the negative form, we should think well of other people, rather than thinking about them as if they're stupid or incompetent. Not just refrain from saying those things, but actually turn it around and think positively about people. Just try that on for size. Imagine if we could adopt that attitude of actually looking at each other with respect and esteem in a positive manner. That's revolutionary already. I could almost stop the sermon right here and say, let's go out and do it. But I'm not going to do that. So in other words, this part of the sermon, what Jesus is talking about in these few verses that we're going to look at today, is interpersonal relationships. That's the topic that we're zooming in on. He's giving instructions for disciples of his, for his disciples, telling them how they should relate to each other. This is his teaching to us, if we claim to be his disciples. The second paragraph then in Matthew chapter 5 will add in, will elaborate on this topic, but it adds in an element that's even more striking. Watch this. Check this out. Let's read 23 and 24. He says, Jesus goes on to say, therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering there before the altar, and go first be reconciled to your brother, and then come and present your offering. So not only does Jesus say you have to make peace. Remember what we just heard. You shouldn't be angry. You certainly shouldn't hurt people. You should deal with your feelings of resentment. And when there is a breach in the relationship, right? When somebody has been wounded by you, or maybe you actually did something that was wrong, that hurt them, or maybe they just perceived it. Jesus is saying when somebody has bad feelings towards you, he says, go and fix it. But not only that, get this. Jesus is saying that work, that task, has priority over worshiping God. You get that? Listen, he uses the illustration. He's saying, imagine an individual, and it's mostly men, in the ancient world. That's why they use the male pronoun he. It was the men who did most of these kind of things. You go into the temple to bring a gift offering to God. That's a good thing to do, isn't it? That's something that we encourage people to do, to have a dedicated personal relationship with God, we say, right? So Jesus is saying there's a person that's going there to do this thing, but then he remembers on the way, oh no, I offended so-and-so, or maybe I did something that was wrong, actually wrong to that person. Jesus says, put the gift down and go take care of it first. That means before you worship God, before you do this sacred act between you and God, Jesus is telling us, hey, there's something that takes priority. You have to go take care of this first. I don't know about you, but that's a very amazing statement to me. Jesus says, stop. Don't even bring your offering to God until you've made it right with your fellow human being. The indication here is, the suggestion is that even if you did go ahead and brought the offering, it's probably not bad, you know what I mean? But there's something about that offering that would not be completely clean and whole if you knew in your heart that you had a sense of alienation or conflict outstanding with somebody else. It's not really pure yet, Jesus is trying to say. It's tainted. As long as you have hostility and as long as there are bad feelings, hostility and resentment between people, the offering is not whole. That dynamic is pretty clear, right? Do you see that? And again, it's a pretty simple passage, really, to follow through. I'm not saying anything that you need a PhD to figure out. We're just following what Jesus says. Like I said, whether or not you actually did something wrong, or if there was just a perception or an ongoing feud between people, the idea here is this: before you can go to worship God truly in heartfelt manner, there's a prerequisite, right? There's a prerequisite. That means something comes first in time or sequence. Without it, your worship is not right, not wholly right, it's not wholly good. Now, I titled this sermon, Worship 101, that, referring to like a college course, right? Really what I wanted to say was prerequisites of worship, but that doesn't sound as good. You know what I mean? So what Jesus is telling us here is the prerequisite of worship is to make peace with people. And I use the term Worship 101 because what does that, those numbers mean? It means it's the foundational course, right? In other words, if you've never studied history before, you take History 101. If you've never studied chemistry before, you take Chemistry 101, right, in college? So what Jesus is telling us here is, you want to know the basics of worship? You want to know what Worship 101 is? Well, actually, it's not going to the temple. It's making peace among the people with whom you have to interact. Worship 101. It requires right relationships. And while I'm on it, you know that Matthew is not the only one to say this, right? You're probably thinking about other places that we've read in the Bible. For Sabbath school right now, we've been reading through Isaiah, correct? And going through the history and all the interactions, all the things he said to the various kings, what they did right, what they did wrong. But right there in the first chapter of Isaiah is one of those classic sayings of the prophets in which he speaks for God and he tells the people, in the voice of God, God says to them, look, I don't care about your sacrifices anymore. I don't want to smell the incense because you're not doing the right thing to each other. So what Jesus is bringing out here is not really brand new, but it's something perennial, and it's something that we should take to heart. Not only that, I want you to just jump for a minute to John chapter 4. John chapter 4. It's not in Matthew, so it seems like we're going a little bit off, but I think it's on this theme too. I want you to take a look at this. While you're turning there, as you will recall, in John chapter 2, Jesus and his disciples have to pass from Judea back to Galilee. There are a couple of different routes they could take. They could go along the coast, they could go across the Jordan and up that way. But this fastest way is to go through Samaria, which was like another country in a way. And they didn't really get along with the Samaritans. So on this journey, it's a long, they're walking and walking. It's in the desert area. Jesus sits at a well, and you know the story. He meets up with a woman, a Samaritan woman. So not only is she a Samaritan, who you're not supposed to interact with if you're Jewish, but typically Jewish men wouldn't talk to women either, especially if you were a rabbi. You wanted to keep yourself pure. So Jesus starts this conversation with the Samaritan woman. You guys all know the story. And he tells her some things about her life that surprise her and shows her, wow, this guy's a prophet, right? So immediately after that incident, she decides to ask him a question in verse 20. Watch this. John chapter 4, verse 20. She says, oh, well, let's back up to write the last clause of verse 19. Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Then she says, our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and she's pointing to Mount Gerizim, which is where the Samaritans did their temple offerings, right? Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, but you people, meaning the Jewish people, say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. So what's she asking about? She's asking about worship, right? What it really is. She says, wow, I have a prophet here. Let me find out finally the answer to this question. What is the proper way to worship? What does Jesus tell her? Does he say Jerusalem? Does he say Gerizim? He says, verse 23, he says, well, let me read the whole passage. Verse 21, woman, believe me, Jesus says, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. Then he skips into verse 23. An hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For such people the Father seeks to be his worshipers. Now, we've heard this many times. Jesus is saying, it's almost as if he's telling her, look, the real issue is not a matter of location, right? It's not here, it's not there. The real issue is that you worship in spirit and truth. We've heard that phrase, right? But the passage doesn't really explain what that means, spirit and truth. Now, we can conjecture that it means that the Holy Spirit was going to come, right? And fill them all with a new attitude, a new mind. But I can't help but think that one of the ways that we worship God in spirit and in truth is how we treat each other, right? Didn't the Holy Spirit come and give the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, and temperance. And how we come to God, we come in a spirit, a true spirit, a really loving spirit and trusting spirit to God. Worshiping in spirit and truth, from what I can tell, has to do with our relationships, how we relate to God, right? And how we relate to each other. So this idea that we're looking at in Matthew chapter 5, and you can turn back there, this is not something that's just isolated in Matthew. The theme runs throughout the Bible. How do we worship God? Before we bring our offer to the temple, what's the prerequisite? that as far as possible, as far as we are able, we try to make peace and reconciliation with people if we have hurt them or if we've been hurt by them. All right, let's just finish the passage in Matthew because it kind of drives it home. And then I want to move into something practical. Take a look at Matthew chapter 5, verse 25. This is, remember, Jesus first talks about it's not enough not to just commit murder. You shouldn't say things bad. Then he says, if you're bringing your offering, leave it there and make peace. Then he says this, verse 25, make friends quickly with your opponent at law while you are with him on the way, so that your opponent may not hand you over to the judge and the judge to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last cent. Now, all of a sudden, Jesus gives this courtroom image. There's been a disparity, right? Your neighbor is bringing you to court for something that you did wrong against him. Jesus is now adding that image in to all the other things we looked at so far. He's saying, look, if somebody's going to take you to court, here's what I advise you. Before you get there, you better work things out. You better, what's the word? Yeah, reconcile. What's the word? When you have a mediate or arbitrator, right? You have an arbitrator. You better get things worked out because I'm telling you, once you get to court, if you haven't taken care of that, not only will you be found guilty is the implication, but you're going to have to pay the price. Or as we say, you will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. You ever see that on signs here and there? Jesus is saying, he's talking about an earthly courtroom, but the context is clear. What Jesus is saying here is, look, if you guys who are supposed to be following me can't come to reconcile with each other, and you hold on to grudges, and you hold on to vendettas, when the real judge comes, right? When the real judgment comes, believe me, you're going to have to come to account, and you're going to pay till the last. What is the word here? The last cent. There's a word I looked at, it came up in one of them, I think it's quadrans. It said it was the smallest coin in the Roman Empire. In other words, you're going to have to pay the full price. So the point is, when you put all of this passage together, being in right relationship to each other, treating each other right is not just a good thing. Right? That Jesus is saying, oh, by the way, would be a nice thing for you guys to do. No, he's saying it's vital. It's central. Remember what we're doing here. We're listening to the teachings of Jesus and what he taught us. It's central to discipleship for us to do whatever we can to make sure we're at peace with each other. And when there are differences and hurts, which happen, we're all human. We all make mistakes. Sometimes we don't even know it. Sometimes we realize it when we're in the middle of doing it. You know what I mean? So we all make mistakes. But what Jesus is saying is it's not just a good thing to make peace. It's actually vital. It's part of your worship to God. Is that clear? You think I did a good job with what he's saying here? I'm not making this up, right? Now, look, I want to do something a little different today. I could stop there again, and I do believe that the Bible has power to transform us. I believe that wholeheartedly, that just getting good teachings, just being exposed to good teachings like this will have a transformative effect on us. You know, the ideas will work in our minds. Maybe we'll go out tomorrow to that person on the job and who we've been having a little conflict with or difficulty with, and we'll say, hey, you know what? Let me try something new. So I think the ideas can speak for themselves. But I do know that reconciliation is a very difficult thing in a lot of cases, right? It's not something that comes naturally. So I would like to just add a little practical part into the sermon today. We covered the theological foundation. I want to now just talk a little bit about practical. What can we do? How can we do this when we know we have a disagreement with somebody? What are we going to do? I would like to suggest that there are 4 skills that we can keep in mind that will help us in the process of making peace. I call them skills. First skill, skills of understanding, communication skills, attitude skills, and negotiation skills. So let me just go over those briefly. When I say understanding skills, I'm talking about understanding ourselves and understanding the other person. When I say understanding ourselves, I mean understanding our own feelings, understanding our own beliefs. Sometimes we feel offended by something. Sometimes we might feel hurt. We might feel angry. And we have to figure out why. What was it that happened that made me feel angry? Sometimes we might know that we left something undone, right? We didn't accomplish something. And when it's pointed out to us, we'll get angry at the moment, but really we're angry at ourselves. You understand what I mean? I'm just giving an example that we have emotions that come up that we may not understand first. That's why I say this first step in resolving conflict is we have to understand ourselves. Sometimes, we are all busy, right? And I'm sure you feel this. I can be going through the day and I know something's bothering me. I don't know what it is. So I'll sit still until it comes to the surface. And then I realize, oh, yeah, it's that thing. This is what I'm talking about. The first step of being able to make peace with somebody else is to understand why you are troubled in the first place. Maybe you felt like you were a failure. Maybe the person actually did neglect you. You have to just determine it. So that's the first thing. We have to be able to understand our own feelings and perspective. But of course, since we're dealing with another person, we have to understand what were they thinking. When I said such and such, how come she got angry? How come he got angry? Oh, because you always do this. Well, what do I always do? You always make yourself out to be bigger than I am, or something like that. I'm making it up as I'm going along. But if you're going to make peace with somebody else, you have to be able to understand how they felt. Am I right? And why they felt that way. How could you fix a problem if you haven't really identified what the problem is? So understanding yourself, understanding the other person, and I'll throw in, to understand the other person, you have to listen. You have to listen. Listen with the intention of trying to find out what they really meant. A lot of times we listen to people, this. We're listening to somebody talk, but really while they're talking, what are we doing? We're preparing what we're going to say next, right? No, you can't listen like that. If it's a serious issue where two people have to work things out, each person has to listen to find out what the other person feels. Is that clear? I call that understanding skills. Second one, I said communication skills. And this is like listening too. But what I mean here is your communication. It's one thing to say, hey, I realize now why I felt bad. It's because I knew I had left that undone. And it kind of came to the surface. And without me realizing it, I felt embarrassed, right? It's one thing for you to realize that. But then the other skill is, are you able to then express it openly and say, look, I'm sorry, this is what happened. I really felt bad. I didn't realize it, and I took it out on you. You know what I mean? Are you able to really articulate what you want to say? And then when you're the one that was offended, are you able to identify what the issue was? Are you able to explain what it is clearly? And can you do it courteously? A lot of times when we do decide to deal with the problem and we're angry, we express it in an angry manner, right? You shout, maybe you bang things. I don't know. Everybody relates a different way. What I'm saying here is we need to be able to express ourselves openly, clearly, directly, but we don't have to do it in an angry manner. You can do it in a courteous manner. It might sound strange, but if you're angry about something, you could tell somebody, look, I felt very angry when you did that. You don't have to yell. You see what I'm saying here? We can define it, but I got my notes mixed up. I'm sorry. My wife warned me of this. She told me putting page numbers on, but of course I'm stubborn, right? So I didn't do that. Okay. Well, anyway, what I'm saying is it's not always easy. It's not always easy, especially when you feel hurt. But what we have to do if we want to make peace, we have to have communication skills. We have to be able to express ourselves well as listen well. Attitude skills, number 3. What I mean by this is you have to have a mindset that you're actually willing to make peace. Am I right? A lot of times we might just want to hold on to the grudge. We may make a decision. I don't want to like that person. You understand what I mean? So this is what I mean by attitude skills. It means like an orientation of the heart. It's a way of thinking in the mind. Are we willing to make peace or not? You know, when I was looking up some Bible verses on this topic, I found one page that actually had some quotes mixed in. Listen to this. This is just a short sentence. It said this: reconciliation is more beautiful than victory. Reconciliation is more beautiful than victory. This is what I'm talking about, attitude. What is our attitude going into our relationships? Are we just there to get the advantage, to win? You know, in a war, this really makes sense. A person could be a winner of a war, but making peace before going to war is more beautiful. But it's the same thing in our interpersonal relationships. This is what I mean, attitude. What is our mindset? And then the other thing is, there's another attitude that helps us to make peace, and that's humility. Am I honest enough and quiet enough to admit that, yeah, I was the one that was wrong in this case? Or am I going to just defend, even though inwardly I know I was the one that made the mistake? That's 3. And then I say negotiation skills. Number 4. Negotiation skills. All right, it's one thing now for 2 people to realize, hey, we had a disagreement about this issue. We both got angry. You know, I wanted to paint the room blue. You wanted to paint the room green. And then, you know, I felt like you always dominate me. And I felt like you never say what you want until the last minute. You know what I mean? So you finally get the emotional thing out. But now you're stuck with the problem. Are we going to make the room blue or are we going to make the room green? So I'm saying negotiation skills. Even when you deal with the interpersonal problem, you still have to figure out, well, what are we going to do now? We have a difference of opinion. That's what I mean by negotiation skills. And that involves creativity. It involves energy and effort. It means you want to put time in to get the thing fixed. Does that make sense? All right, so I said understanding skills, communication skills, attitude skills, and negotiation skills. And I realized after the fact that acronym, U-C-A-N, it says you can. It says you can, right? So let's end, though, where we started, going back to what Jesus told us to do. You can make peace if we want to. We can, right? That word if is pivotal, right? If you want to, you can make peace. But why would we want to? All right, so this is to bring us back to the religious aspect. First of all, why would we want to make peace? Because it's good. Peace is better than conflict. Would you agree? We may try to brush it aside, right? We may try to go on with our own lives and not solve the problem. And we might try to block it out of our minds and have some success. But the world is not well until there's healing. That's number 1. Not only that, it's healthy. It's healthy to make peace. Listen to this other quote that I came up on that same page, unexpectedly. I love this one. 3 sentences. The first to apologize is the bravest. In other words, that's the person that gets the thing started, that actually wades into the problem and opens up the opportunity for healing. The first to apologize is the bravest. Then the second sentence says, the first to forgive is the strongest. In other words, the one who has the strongest sense of self-control and control of the emotions to say, okay, we'll let it go. The first to apologize is the bravest. The first to forgive is the strongest. And then get this one. The last one is the punchline. The first to forget is the happiest. So why is it that we want to work for healing? It's because it's good, because it's healthy. But the other reason is this, to bring us back to where we started. This is God's will. This is God's will for us. This is God's vision for his disciples. As a matter of fact, this is God's everlasting vision for the world. I didn't mention it, but it's earlier in the passage is where Jesus said to his followers, you are the light of the world. And he said, you are the salt of the earth. This is what we are called to be as disciples of Christ. We're called to be examples of peace and reconciliation as far as we are able. We can't just sweep it under the rug. Jesus says, no. If you try to sweep it under the rug and you don't take care of issues, then when you come to worship, yeah, that's okay. It's not bad. You know, and it's good to come to God, but it's not whole yet. There's a spot, there's like a shadow on it, because Jesus knows that the worship 101, the prerequisite is to have peace. Then we come to God and everybody's reconciled. We're reconciled to each other and we're reconciled to God. That's a beautiful thing. So this is, you could say, if Jesus is saying in this passage is correct, reconciliation is actually our first calling. It takes priority over worship. It's not a secondary issue. It's a priority. As a matter of fact, let me end on this note. It's integral to God's very being and character. Reconciliation is what God is all about. Reconciliation is how God acts. Reconciliation is what God is working on. There's a passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 where Paul says, God in Christ has reconciled all men to himself, not imputing their trespasses against them. And then he says, therefore, Paul says, be reconciled. Be reconciled to God and be reconciled to each other, because that's what we are called to do. Closing hymn is number 109.